Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Before Shangri-La was a museum open to the public, before any curators or directors here, before even the establishment of the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, there was Carol Bier and her relationship to this property. Because about 6 years after Doris Duke had passed away, while the estate was being assessed and settled, Carol was brought here onto this property by the legal team and asked under very, very strict instructions not to let anybody know where she was or what she was going to see. And she was asked if there's anything on this property that has any kind of cultural or historical relevance or value. Can you imagine being brought on this property and being asked, really, is this stuff worth anything, really? And so that's Carol's introduction to this incredible property. Carol has had a number of positions and responsibilities. She was the former curator of the Eastern Hemisphere's collections at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., and she still acts as a consultant there. She's the former president of the Textile Society of America, and in that capacity, she brought the biennial convention here to Hawaii. She's currently part of the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley as visiting scholar in the Center for Islamic Studies, and has recently given many talks, some for the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute, the American Math Society, the Mathematical Association of America, but most recently spent 1 month in India getting rejuvenated, invigorated, and excited about its art and architecture, just as Doris Duke had 8 decades earlier. And now she's here to tell us all about it and more. Okay, Carol Bier.
Mahalo nui. It's great to be back. The only trouble with an introduction like that is how can one possibly live up to expectations? So I thought I'd start with a good Turkish joke about Nasreddin Hoca, who in the Persian tradition is Mullah Nasreddin. And he was about to give a lecture and didn't know what he was going to say. And he asked the audience, how many of you know what I'm going to say? And about half of them raised their hand. And then he said, how many of you don't know what I'm going to say? And about half of them raised the hand. And he said, well, why don't those of you who know what I'm going to say talk to those of you who don't? Well, it's sort of like that, talking about symmetry and pattern in Islamic art, which here is symmetry and pattern at Shangri-La. And what one thinks of first in thinking about symmetry and pattern in Islamic art is the Alhambra in Granada, Spain, which from the outside, they are set in the Sierra Nevadas, and now that I live in California, the real Sierra Nevadas, is that it's a very kind of plain brick structure, red tile roofs. You'd never know of the extraordinary designs on the interior. Here we're looking up from a square cubic space into a transition zone leading up to the dome with intricately carved and segmented vaults called mukarnas, and then looking up further into the dome, which is quintessentially, from a mathematical point of view, one of the most extraordinary human creations of symmetry and pattern in the history of mankind. I probably can say that modestly. But another great monument with extraordinary symmetry and pattern is the Taj Mahal. This is a photograph taken by my daughter, and being my daughter didn't want to do anything in the normative way. It's the back of the Taj Mahal, which you never get to see. The front is the iconic view that shows this very, very strict axis of symmetry, and a reflecting pool where the entirety of the white marble-clad building is reflected in the water. So you have both a vertical and a horizontal axis of symmetry. And what I wanted to start my lecture with in bringing Shangri-La into the picture is what then Doris Duke took from such images within the Islamic world and how she incorporated it here on site. But first, let's consider symmetry, literally similarity of measure. The sim of symmetry is like similar, and metry like geometry, earth measure. Similarity of measure, correspondence of points, a sense that every point on the left side of this image finds a corresponding point on the right side of the image across an axis, a vertical axis of symmetry, shown here in the picture. And in the reflection, just looking at the pool, every point on the upper real side finds a corresponding point in the reflected side below that axis of symmetry. Symmetry is also a fundamental organizing principle, not only in art, but in nature. And one of the things that Doris Duke has done here is set her, one can hardly say collection. I mean, she bought this to live with. We didn't even know, we Islamic art historians, we didn't even know that she was collecting Islamic art for 6 decades until her will went through, I don't know whether it was the probate process or something equivalent, and she had established the Doris Duke Foundation of Islamic Art. So here we see the Taj Mahal, and here we see the Mughal garden, which is just above us here. And you can see the elements not only in the plantings of the cypress trees, in the delineation of the garden areas that are designated for planting. Let me go back and you can see some similarity there. And in the combined use of alleys and waterways to define the garden access. Looking at the Alhambra and the Taj Mahal plan in comparison, the Taj Mahal is a unitary structure, set. It's a pool set in the middle. It's set at the edge of a quartered Persian-style garden called a charbagh, 4-garden layout. And each of the 4 gardens delineated by waterways and avenues, walkways, khiyaban, is then subsequently divided and divided and divided. So it's one unified conception of a whole. Whereas the Alhambra has symmetry in each of its component elements, but it is not one unified conceptual whole. In fact, it was built over the course of decades and sequence of rulers in Granada. But what struck me as I was preparing this lecture is the similarity of what Doris Duke has composed here, one time and one place, more or less, over the course of a few years, but with a very strict axis of symmetry between the playhouse and the main living quarters, and this was originally her tennis court, and the outbuildings, the houses arranged for maintenance and support, the swimming pool. And it's also composed of small units within which there is strict symmetry and lines of symmetry that relate one section to another. So there's many different components here on site, and it's only 5 acres, but what a lot of components are packed into it and arranged with brilliant symmetry and brilliant transitions from one section to another. They're the classic axial view from the living room to the playhouse to the living room. And where in the world would you find the combination of the Alhambra and the Taj Mahal? Anywhere except at Shangri-La. So this has a uniqueness and an extraordinary sense of aesthetic and playfulness of form and structure that I dare say was unique to Doris Duke. You would not find this in a museum context because it's not the nature of what we in museums do with cultural artifacts. This was something that she built for herself I don't even think she had posterity in mind when she built it, in terms of what I know of her, how she lived now, looking back, how she collected, and how she put things together for a symphony of pure form. So here we see columns from, if not the Alhambra, something Nasrid in Spain within the kingdom of the Nasrids, combined with the Jali, the carved and pierced marble screen of the door, the sliding door that gives entrance to the Mughal suite recently. In the Taj Mahal, as example, we see the combination of geometric elements, here Muqarnas, not entirely visible because of the lack of articulation with shade and light, but combined with floral ornament also arranged geometrically, and Arabic calligraphy, which has an underlying structure of geometry. So geometry underlies all of the elements that we see within this example of Islamic art, but it really is a characteristic that permeates all Islamic art. So we've shifted again from Taj Mahal in India, in Agra, to the Alhambra in Granada, Spain, and again the combination of geometric pattern with symmetry as its organizing principle, floral ornament, and Arabic calligraphy. Interestingly, neither in India nor in Spain is Arabic the local indigenous language. It's the language that came to each of those countries with the expansion of Islam, in Spain in the 8th century and in India initially a couple of centuries later. But what we see on the bottom here of the Alhambra slide is a detail of a ceramic panel, and you'll recognize this pattern as something Doris Duke had replicated in a lot of textiles that she constructed and used as borders for materials that she wanted to hang. For example, the curtains in the dining room have an imbricated or a battlement border like that. But below it is the section that I want us to focus on today, and that is an oblique square grid with 8 pointed stars at each of the points of intersection. It changes in color, which is something that we'll get into in a point. And what this is, the repetition of a single shape that covers the space, it covers the plane with no gaps and no overlaps. So underlying that oblique pattern and underlying this oblique pattern is a grid of polygons that are a single shape repeated to cover the plane with no gaps and no overlaps. That's called a tessellation. And in the Alhambra, there are many such tessellations, which, in order to perceive how the shapes work together to tessellate within a square grid or a rhombic grid or a triangular grid, you have to subtract color from your visual reckoning of what you're looking at. That's hard for some people. You get used to it in time. But there you see uses of banded color, that is algorithmic uses of color, different arrangements, clusters alternating green and yellow, different shapes, blue and dark blue. And it was all these features of Islamic art that inspired M.C. Escher, the Dutch graphic artist of the mid-20th century, to make a series of drawings. These are actually from his sketchbook in a book published by Doris Schatzschneider, a colleague of Dave's and mine, a senior colleague of Dave's and mine. And he copied the pattern we were just looking at. He didn't have the yellow and the blue alternation, but he was trying to understand the underlying structure of the pattern in 2 dimensions. And up until his time visiting the Alhambra, I think it was in the 1930s, he was doing landscape drawings and figural paintings, and his visit to the Alhambra changed his whole approach to art and woodblock printing. And his woodblock prints were an evolution from his work of these sketches at the Alhambra. And And he wanted to animate what he considered to be geometric drawings that were abstract and, from his perspective, uninteresting. So he put in horses and lizards and frogs and the M.C. Escher, whose art we're somewhat more familiar with, and then sometimes even went so far as to metamorphose the pattern from one to another sequence. And in some ways, the patterning in Islamic art became more recognized because of Escher's work and its relationship to Islamic art in the late 20th century. Doris Duke had recognized its beauty earlier, from when she first was exposed to it. Well, that maybe wasn't the first time she was exposed to it, but on her honeymoon with James Cromwell, where the honeymoon was an around-the-world tour. Hawaii was the last stop. They stayed here for 4 months. I mean, this was a honeymoon, yes. The marriage didn't last, but her love of Hawaii lasted. This takes us back to the Taj Mahal as a carved and pierced marble screen. It's only black because we're looking at it from the shade, looking out into the sun. But what you can see is there's one shape, this kind of bow tie, that is repeated horizontally and vertically, that covers the plane with no gaps and no overlaps. And within each of those bow tie shapes, there is a delineation of other shapes that's the same in each of them. So a good example of a tessellation, of which there are many, many in Shangri-La. The most obvious to me are the carved and pierced jali, the marble screens, on top of the, on the rooftop patio of the Mughal suite. Each one of these deserves careful attention and analysis to understand exactly what the pattern is and what's going on. Well, just what is a pattern? I've reduced it to a unit that is repeated according to an organizing principle. Now, there are many such organizing principles. Fractals, for one, only discovered in the late 1970s by Benoit Mandelbrot. Had always existed, but we humans only first began to understand it in the late 1970s. Another is systems of proportion, geometric systems of proportion with different scales. A third is symmetry, and symmetry is the main system of pattern organization in Islamic art. Symmetry, which is a mathematical concept that derives from the study of crystals and their growth and formation. And the cross-section of the crystals gives us a system of patterns based on only 4 symmetry operations. So the 4 basic symmetries are translation, which is moving along in one direction, every point consistently repeated, same distance, same direction, but in a line. Reflection, that we've talked about in terms of the Alhambra and the Taj Mahal, and reflection is the symmetry that we seem to be most familiar with, maybe partly because we are, at least externally, symmetrical, bilaterally. I think it also reflects our education system for not recognizing these other symmetries that are equally present in nature and in art. Glide reflection, where the figure or the form is turned and moved along a vector, and rotation, where it is turned around a point back to its identity position. So translation, reflection, glide reflection, and rotation are the only 4 symmetries that underlie all we know of patterns in the plane, as well as patterns in 3 dimensions for which symmetry is the organizing principle. Now, that needs to be qualified because a new system of pattern organization called quasi-periodicity was the recipient, Dan Shechtman, the recipient of the Nobel Prize in 2011. So fractals 1979, quasi-periodicity in 2011, we're talking about the forefront of mathematical understanding and development when we look at symmetry and pattern beyond what was known 15 years ago even. Symmetry operation, repeating some of what was on the slide before, a rigid motion, meaning every point finds its corresponding point in the same manner that enables the transformation of a unit. So moving along a vector, across a vector, around a point, or displaced and moved along a vector. So to break that down to the most simple, a unit that is repeated according to the organizing principle, in this case of translation. If one accepts that unit as a square, we've moved it and created a square grid. All the angles are 90 degrees in any direction, and everything is moved in 2 directions to cover the plane. Theoretically, with no gaps and no overlaps, I've put in some gaps there so that you can see the individual squares. Otherwise, it would just be one great big square 9 times the size of the first square. But you can elaborate on what you do with those squares. So for example, on site, we have numerous pavements that in some cases Doris Duke herself installed on site, and with the help of Jin De Silva, among others of her staff. Sometimes she even was involved in cutting the marble to fit the spaces that she was working with. But where each square is created by 4 right isosceles triangles, and color is added, and the delineation of the exterior is added. So cutting a square in half, cutting a square and a quarter, cutting a square in half. So the exterior border changes it, the color changes it, and the division of the square in half changes it, but it's still an underlying square grid, and the unit that is repeated to cover the plane with no gaps and no overlaps. 2 other examples, these from the dining room of several years ago. They may have moved since then, but a trunk with mother of pearl inlay in a square grid where the squares are laid obliquely. The grid is an oblique square grid. Here, where the squares, similarly to what we had just seen, are divided and colored differently, color alternation in the larger version, and divided in half with color alternation creating diagonal bands, and a tabouret in which there is also the division of squares into right isosceles triangles. So again, patterns in which there are 90 degrees or half of 90 degrees, 45 degrees, which characterize them. And here we have, in addition, the conceptual overlay of 6 or 8 pointed stars. Curiously, both, which is itself unusual. So here's an example of that same square grid, but we've put it on point instead of on edge. And it becomes an oblique square grid, still with 90-degree angles. To give you some examples of those from objects in this collection and elsewhere, this is the embroidered Indian panel now in the Mughal suite behind one of the inlaid mother-of-pearl chests that Doris Duke had for her personal wardrobe, storage of her personal wardrobe. A pile carpet from a region in northern Iran or Central Asia, oblique square grid with lattice medallions. Another oblique square grid used on a trapping from Central Asia, in which there's both the use of wool and cotton in the textile structure. You can go further. You can divide the square or cross squares with a background. As we see here, cross squares yield an 8-pointed star, and here that 8-pointed star is creating a pattern with now negative space and positive space. And here we have the combination of 90 degrees and 45 degrees together being 135 degrees, so this oblique angle, obtuse angle, would be 135, and then you can play with those angles and both add and subtract in playing with the pattern. This is a little bit of a stretch because it's really a square grid, but it's based on 8-pointed stars. So I've included it in that example, and this is the interior courtyard that you came through as you entered the building, and then look back, if you look back, and a 12-pointed pool in the center of that interior courtyard. We'll spend a few minutes looking at this pattern in particular, which is one of my favorites, and most intriguing, I found. I was really excited when I realized, oh, that's the same pattern. Looks like two patterns, but it's the same pattern. And I don't know if I can convey to you how exciting it was for me to discover that. I just had thought it was two patterns. Not only the same pattern in terms of its structure, but the same pattern in terms of the colors. What's different is the proportionality of the cobalt blue and the turquoise blue, and the amount of buff ceramic that's left unglazed, and in addition, the inclusion of little molded elements in one set of tiles, which cause the glaze to pool. So visually, we respond to this same pattern as having very different components. Visually, we're seeing much more diversity than, in fact, the pattern structure reveals. The geometry of this shows that typically it's based on a point. Doesn't show, oh, the circle, oh, it doesn't, yeah, there's the circle. You can hardly see it. A circle divided into first 4 and then 8 points, which yields cross squares when you connect the points. And the cross square is one form of 8-pointed star, but inside there's a second type of 8-pointed star. And then by extending and erasing certain lines, you get a third kind of 8-pointed star. And it's this process of construction, addition, subtraction, connection that yields the pattern that we see on the tiles. Now, I took this pattern. It's also recorded by Jules Bourgoin in the late 19th century in a book of his drawings from Cairo and Damascus. And I used it for teaching a summer school after I had done my residency here, and after Dave and I had done a presentation for the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. One of the people in the audience, Char Morrow, came up to me after our presentation and said, wow, my husband and I teach summer math at Mount Holyoke College. We want you to come and do a 2-week workshop for high school students. So I worked with this pattern with the summer math young women who were from inner cities all over the United States for an opportunity to study mathematics. You know, studies have shown that young women in middle school diverge from young men in middle school, and thereafter they don't do as well in mathematics. So this was a program that was funded to help give these young women opportunities to succeed in mathematics, and these are some of the patterns and workshops that we created within the 2 weeks that we worked together. But all of these patterns are based upon this one pattern that is the underlying structure of the panels at the back of the interior courtyard. I will speak up. Are we working on this all?
Speak up for now. I think that the soundboard is giving us issues.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me know if you can't hear me, and I will endeavor to speak more loudly. Then I also did the same experiment with my students at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, where I taught for 12 years. And the assignment was to take that one pattern and color it in with one color, and then color it in with 2 colors, and color it in with 3 colors. And I only give this one example, which is not the best example because they're using the pattern in the same way. But for 35 students, we came up with 135 different patterns. And you can see some of these that utilize different symmetries within that same pattern. And it was so exciting to me, I used it as a paper for the Bridges Art Math Conference, and then I published it as Islamic Art and Exploration in Pattern. And part of the reason that I mentioned the summer math and the Bridges and the NCTM is to demonstrate what an extraordinary experience it was for me to be on site for 2 weeks working with Dave on geometry and pattern, symmetry and pattern in Islamic art. And that laid, what was 12 years ago, that laid the foundation for the whole rest of my professional life. Just extraordinary opportunity was offered here. Thank you. We shift quickly to a hexagonal pattern, and there's one beautiful example of that, which really just is hexagonal tiles, and then a medallion introduced, and that's in the architectural panel beyond the dining room lanai. And then another classic example is the Jolly. This is one from up above the Mughal suite, which has served as a basis for another article that I've written, and that is demonstrating that the hexagonal grid is intersected at two middle points, but not midpoints of each edge, to create another system of overlapping hexagons. And when you extend the two, you see that there are two intersecting polygonal grids, and that has served as the basis of my work that I just recently presented in January at the American Mathematical Society on intersecting polygons and the exploration of two-dimensional space. So again, the impact of Shangri-La on what I've been doing. All of these patterns, and I've focused on the grids, but we could have focused on individual design elements manipulated, and the manipulation leads you to these grids, all fundamentally reside in grids of regular polygon, square, triangle, hexagon, or stretched or set on point, so you have a variety of possibilities. And this slide, again, to show you that each of these screens deserves to be carefully studied to understand what that pattern structure is. This is a panel in the room that I think is now called the smaller Syrian room. It's changed its name from the pejorative name that Doris had given it herself. And a student of Dave's worked with us on this, developing some flash programs to show the rotational symmetries that are present in this one panel of cut and inlaid marbles. It's a rotation order 2, rotation order 3, and rotation order 6. Here is the rotation order 2, rotation order, here, rotation order 3, and rotation order 6, and if we're lucky, yep, they still work. Yeah, rotation order 2 of 2 hexagons on the square, rotation order 3, 3 squares on the triangle, and rotation order 6, 6 squares on the hexagon. That was really impressive that he was able to do that. You have to go to young people to do this technology stuff. So if we take those basic symmetries of translation, reflection, glide reflection, and rotation, translation, reflection, glide reflection, and rotation, there are only 7 possible symmetry groups in the line, that is, frieze or border patterns. F here stands for any design. You can only manipulate it in 7 possible ways to create a border pattern, what I've called a border pattern. And if you extend that from 1 dimension to 2 dimension, there are only 17 possible ways of exploring the plane. And all of these have been recognized in the patterning of the Alhambra and my website on symmetry and pattern, hosted by the Math Forum, that is now under the NCTM, the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics, continues to win awards, even though it was a website that I developed with the Math Forum in the 1990s. But you can refer to that for more information about all of these. Since that went up live on the web in the 90s, I have addressed a number of other aspects of symmetry and pattern, not the least of which is symmetry breaking. So where symmetry seems to exist, but really it's not exactly one point correspondent to another point. So we move from the mathematical realm to the physical realm, that is the realm of physics, and we find a distinction between symmetry being a correspondence of points to asymmetry being the absence of symmetry, to symmetry breaking being the absence of an expected symmetry. And I've pushed that along, and the bulk of my work on that was when I examined the Suzanne collection here of Doris Duke, which became the basis for several additional publications. Symmetry breaking is the same really as approximate symmetry, where conceptually we can see there's symmetry, but in reality there's not. And this can be extended further to recognize that in symmetry and symmetry breaking, as we see in this particular Suzanne, there's lots of local symmetry, but that doesn't play itself out globally. And then there's global symmetry that doesn't play itself out locally. So an interesting contrast that we see, again, both in nature and in art, and what better place to explore that than Shangri-La. I'm gonna jump ahead a bunch of slides quickly. To end the talk, we can go back to these if you want, but in particular, I want to end the talk so that there is time for discussion and question and answers, and emphasize, I'm sure this is not an audience where I need to emphasize this, but how wrong it is to think about Shangri-La as the confection of a willful, rich individual, and rather recognize that it's one of the richest repositories in the world, where one can study not only the geometry of nature, but also the nature of geometry. Thank you.